The first rule of running a solo tug in the fringe is never promise anything that can't survive an audit. And the second is never joke with species that treat grammar like law, which is how Jacques Monroe broke both rules before lunch. He was arguing with a docking clerk over a surcharge that had learned to multiply when something. Emerald and gold slammed into him like a comet looking for a thesis advisor. Wings rustled, horns caught the station lights, and a young draconian straightened with the crisp dignity of someone who believed gravity was a negotiable treaty. "Apologies, Sky Traveler," she said, voice warm enough to melt bureaucracy. "Seeking passage inward. Urgent. Passenger deck is 3 rings up," Jacques said, checking whether his credit chip had survived the impact with its pride intact. "They refused me," she said, unoffended. "Local superstitions about draconians and probability." He waved her toward anywhere else until she added, matter of fact, 30,000 credits for immediate transit, and the number snapped his attention like a rubber band on a bad habit. "Half now, half on arrival," she added, producing a verified stick that glowed the dangerous blue of solvency. "My tug is not a passenger liner," he said, weak against the arithmetic. "Work required loading, nav assists, no fire, no poetry." Her crest brightened in what could only be enthusiasm. "Agreed," she said, which turned out to be a binding spell in her culture and a headache in his. They reached Bay 19, where the Kestrel waited one good engine, one honest, and a galley that apologized for existing. "Stow gear in Cargo 3, Jacques said, already compiling the repairs 30,000 could revive. "I will store in your quarters," she said serenely. "No," he replied with the brittle certainty of a man outnumbered by a single sentence. "You specified work," she countered, producing a recorder and playing his voice back to him with the gentle malice of perfect memory. "On my world, crew shares quarters with shipmaster to build trust and prevent mutiny. It's a one-room tug," he said, regretting past conversions of living space into cargo math. "Trust can sleep in Cargo 3. She tilted her head. "Then we share the room, allocate territory, and negotiate warmth." "Yes, that is not what he began, and discovered that some arguments are topological. Every path led to the same cozy nest. "Name's Alira of Emberwick," she said, extending a hand that radiated a comfortable disaster. "I will pay, work, and not combust anything vital." "Jocks," he said, and somewhere inside the tug, a bearing promised to fail in exactly the way money fixes. He set 3 rules during preflight, which is a ritual that comforts pilots and amuses gods. 1. No breathing anything weapon adjacent indoors, he said. 2. Nothing hangs from life support, ever. 3. You sleep in Cargo 3. "Obviously," she said to the first. "Wise," she said to the second. "And unacceptable," she said to the third. "Proximity to shipmaster is a security doctrine across 17 systems," she added, which sounded invented until she produced documentation, a draconian sport. Jocks launched anyway, because leaving often solves arguments geography creates. The Kestrel eased past the traffic beacons, ancillary ring fading to a necklace behind them, and the starfield widened into that familiar invitation humans keep misunderstanding as permission. Alira studied the cockpit, then the environmental readout, and nudged the thermostat toward what dragons call pleasant and people call sauna. "Back down," Jacques said, sweating on principle. "You are shivering," she observed. "I am simmering," he corrected, which did not survive peer review. The nest arrived 20 minutes later, a fortified landscape of blankets, flight suits, and what looked suspiciously like emergency thermal liners repurposed as architecture. "Those are for emergencies," Jacques said. "This is," Alira said gravely. "Insufficient nesting materials threaten operational efficiency." "Operational efficiency does not sleep in my room," he said, already losing ground to logistics. "On your world," she asked, arranging fabric with ruthless competence, "is denying a crew member proper heat considered hospitality?" He opened his mouth, discovered ethics were colder than she was, and closed it. Jocks tried sleeping in the cockpit like a thief in his own ship, and made it 3 steps into the quarters before a voice from the nest said, "You walk very loudly for stealth." "I'm not stealthing," he lied, which fogged in the air like breath that had opinions. "You are cold," Alira added, a diagnosis delivered with the bedside manner of a portable son. "Humans run cooler," he said, annoyed at physiology for testifying. "Not that cool," she said, and confiscated his blanket with a due process efficiency that made protest feel ceremonial. "To the nest," she commanded. "Dragon body heat is the most efficient warming system in the galaxy." "That sounds intimate," he said, "because words sometimes audition for bravery." "That sounds practical," she corrected, "unless you intend more." He did not, emphatically, and climbed into the engineered cocoon with the dignity of a man prioritizing survival over metaphors. The heat was immediate, generous, and persuasive. Wings arched, making a canopy that turned recycled air into something like kindness, and the ship's hum slipped down a note as if agreeing with the arrangement. "See," Alira said, smugness softened by warmth. "Practical." "Provisional," he corrected, relaxing despite the policy memo he was writing in his head. "Why solitary?" she asked, voice low, not a pry so much as a map request. "Easier than explaining myself," he said, which was true the way triage is. "Excuses acquire poetry when repeated," she said gently. He considered arguing, and instead listened to her breathing, which had the rhythm of a metronome, teaching ships to be brave. Morning smelled like ambition, and something nearly on fire. Alira had discovered the galley's theoretical potential, and transformed it into a test kitchen for draconian cuisine, adapted to human survivability. "Breakfast," she announced, plating a dish that glowed at the edges like it remembered stars. "What did you reduce?" he asked, arming himself with water. "Capsaicin by 90%, she said, which turned out to be arithmetic and not mercy. "It's excellent," he wheezed, eyes staging a small rebellion, and she laughed, a sound like wind chimes that forgot to be delicate. By midday, they had a routine, which is what chaos becomes when it realizes someone is watching. Alira rearranged the cockpit for tail-inclusive ergonomics. Jocks rearranged it for "don't touch that we die," and compromise took the form of taped lines and a shared glare at the windshield wiper toggle. She proposed intuitive routing, which sounded like prophecy. He proposed star charts, which sounded like not dying, and the Kestrel threaded the middle like a diplomat. When the first unscheduled asteroid field appeared, dense, metallic, humming in a way his sensors called noise and her bones called north, he understood why she'd said dragons navigate by feel. "Left 15 no, 16, Alira said, eyes half closed, scales at a faint glow. "That's into a rock," he said, steering into trust, because sometimes that's the only door open. The rock unfolded a scene just wide enough for a ship and a change of heart, and they slipped through on account that neither had taught the other, and both somehow knew. After, Jox's hands shook in the honest way, and Alira touched his shoulder with heat, calibrated to reassurance. "You chose to trust," she said simply. "I chose the only option that kept us statistically alive," he said, which translated loosely to "thank you." "Both truths can be true," she answered, and the nest that night required less negotiation and more gravity. They were 2 jumps from the interior lanes, when the band filled with the kind of noise pirates call charisma. "Weapons hot," Jock said, which was theater. The Kestrel's armament consisted of hope and a wrench. "Open cargo," Alira said, scales brightening into a frequency instrument's red as superstition. "That's vacuum," he objected, "because somebody had to. Do you trust me?" she asked, and it landed between them like a hand extended over a gap. He opened the bay and learned there are breaths besides fire, and some of them look like starlight, deciding to take sides. Afterward, when heat debt made her sway, he caught her and didn't call it intimate, just efficient, and carried her to the nest because practical had learned a new definition. Alira slept like a banked forge, the kind of sleep where warmth becomes grammar and a ship's hum lowers itself out of respect. And Jox lay awake long enough to realize that efficiency had found a new definition that didn't fit in any flight manual he owned. When she stirred, it was with the soft disorientation of someone who had spent more than she intended. And his first act of engineering that morning was not a repair, but a promise. He rerouted waste heat from the Yust. Kestrel's hungry engine jacket into a coil he bolted under the deck by the ridiculous effective nest. Heat debt cleared faster with copper and care, Alira murmured, eyes half-lidded, and he pretended the compliment was about tubing and not about the way he'd sat there timing her breaths like a technician, learning a new instrument. He brewed coffee at a temperature both species could forgive, watched her doctor the galley into something between a lab and a campfire. and conceded silently, because pride is a territorial animal, that her breakfast could be described as tasty even when it negotiated directly with his tear ducts. Work, she declared after, flicking a claw at the cargo ledger where 30,000 had begun to sprout obligations. Parts first, then territory negotiations about blankets. Haven Spoke was a ring with more reputations than berths, the kind of way station where paperwork wore brass knuckles and smiles were rented by the hour. Docking control cleared them into a wedge of hangar that smelled like old money and new welds, and the clerk and accountant in a uniform's body squinted at Alira with the bureaucratic courage of someone who believes policy can outstare physics. No open flames, no tail hazards, and no cohabitation in single-occupancy berths, he recited, tapping a placard that had been written by lawyers who feared blankets. Alira pressed play on her wretched recorder and let Jax's earlier crew, not passengers, loop once like a chorus that wins cases. Then she added in the tone of a diplomat who knows she's right, crew shares quarters by doctrine across 17 systems to prevent mutiny. We will accept an inspection instead of a debate. The clerk blinked, measured the cost of arguing against a very calm dragon, and stamped an authorization that read "You win this round" in several languages of ink. They bought a bearing that wouldn't lie, 2 gasket sets that promised fidelity, and a heat exchanger insert that would keep the engine's temper from learning bad habits. Then Jax hovered over a salvage board, like a man at an auction, pretending detachment. "Courier beacon," the broker said without looking up, voice flat with the commerce of peril, gown in a metallic drift, locals call the chorus. Pays legit, pays fast, if you can thread the field without arguing with magnetism. Alira's crest brightened the way horizons do right before ill-advised adventures, and she turned to Jax with the frank hunger of someone who hears her own name when Orr sings. "Dragonfield," she said, reverent and greedy at once, and he sighed the sigh of a man who has already decided and is now negotiating with his future self about phrasing. "Half the bounty up front," he told the broker, and the man snorted, which in that economy meant yes, with conditions attached, and nicked corners on the credits. They prepped like adults and bickered like roommates whose lives depended on their choreography, which they did. Alira taped a tail lane into the cockpit with a neatness that deserved a patent. Jax labeled 3 switches nitrogen monoxide in a font large enough to beat adrenaline, and together they rewired the forward grid to accept a Faraday throw if the chorus decided to teach them manners via sparks. "Why alone?" Alira asked during the last check, not idly, and he gave her the version of his history that contained all the true parts, without the parts that still had teeth. "Trusted wrong," he said, cinching a harness, which is a sentence any port can translate. "Then trust right," she replied, as if the world were a dial, one could simply flip to the correct setting. And he wanted to argue, but instead handed her the O panel, like it was a vote that counted. The chorus announced itself, with a tremor in the needles and a taste in the fillings. A swarm of iron-rich pebbles and slow boulders that magnetized each other's worst habits and sang in staticky harmonics that made sensors shrug. Alira turned her head like a compass with opinions and closed her eyes, and the scales along her jaw lit faintly in a pattern that looked like sheet music for someone else's sky. 4 degrees down, 2 right. "Now quiet engines," she said, and Jax killed thrust to drift on geometry and nerve. The field answered with the groan of iron deciding to be river instead of ruin, and the kestrel slipped between threads of force that would have plucked lesser halls into bad chords. "If I say sing, you will sing," Alira added, serene, and he said something about pilots not singing on duty that sounded suspiciously like agreement. Of course the beacon wasn't where it wanted to be. Beacons in trouble never are. They found it tucked under a beard of iron whiskers that had grown out of a lost panel, the way regret grows from shortcuts. In the courier itself, an old arrow of a ship lay canted, intact, and out of patience. Thermal creep in the coil, Jax diagnosed by ear, because some lies have a sound, and a structural beard trying to claim salvage rights by osmosis. "Teach heat to leave politely," Alira suggested, "and I will shave the iron's pride." He grinned despite himself, spooled a quench line from the kestrel to the courier's sulking guts, and began walking the coil back from nostalgia to honesty while she crawled. along the whiskers with a cutter and a lullaby that changed the chorus's meter by a hair. Crew of one in stasis. Jocks read off the dim telemetry once power steadied, and a hold full of seed vials with a shelf life measured in apology if we're late. Alira's crest dimmed into focus. Then be early, she said. And he did, because there are some cargoes you rush, even if you dislike running. They pulled the courier free with a tug that sounded like relief, coupled air to wake the pilot without scaring his blood, and listened while a groggy man repeated thank you in every language he had paid to learn. Next time, Jocks told him, choose routes that don't sing at you, and the pilot promised to stop being young by tomorrow, which is the most anyone can promise on a ring like this. They pushed the courier into Haven Spokes Lane, collected the rest of their bounty from a broker who pretended not to be impressed, and Jocks bought a coil memory cage he didn't strictly need because he now had a partner who treated heat like a conversation and that changes what is sensible. Back aboard, Alira built a celebratory nest that could have passed code on 3 worlds if codes measured good ideas, then cooked a victory meal that set off the Kestrel smoke detector in a key that almost matched the chorus. And Jocks laughed with real relief for the first time in a year. Trust is a muscle, she said, handing him a plate and a look, train or atrophy. He lifted his cup in the general direction of humility and admitted the obvious with the sort of courage that only arrives when no one is grading you. Tomorrow, he said, we file a crew share properly, buy a blanket that's legally a wall, and set a course for inner lanes. And the way Alira nodded made bureaucracy look almost like adventure. They registered Alira Engineering Consultant Crew with a clerk who had decided not to have opinions until after lunch, bought a thermal curtain certified to satisfy 4 species modesty laws, and taped it in a line that managed to be both boundary and joke, which is the right way to do lines in small rooms. Behold, Jock said, with ceremony, the Treaty of Blanket, and Alira touched the hem as if it were a flag worth saluting. He added her retinas to systems access, which is a vow in any language, and she set a low-temperature lockout on the thermostat that would save them 3 arguments a week, which is love refracted through engineering. Then the Kestrel pushed off Haven Spoke with parts that fit, accounts that balanced, and a weight aboard that was not cargo but future, which is heavier and more buoyant at once. Route? Alira asked, co-pilot seat now adjusted for wings, tail, and unignorable opinions. Inner lanes by the long cut, calm rocks, fewer wolves, more rules. Final is New Kyoto for papers. Then onward to your claim, Jock said, tasting the word claim like it might have a bite. Territory is an argument with time and cousins, Alira said, perfectly calm, which is the sort of sentence that makes a human imagine law offices and fire pits in the same building. We'll get you there with our ship intact, he replied, and she let the word our settle in the air without pouncing on it, which meant it had already won. They ran drills, because drills are how you tell a ship you love it. Depressurization, engine quench, sensor blindness, Alira's seam call, woven in as a formal step, so Jocks wouldn't pretend later it had been accidental. They argued about spice ratios and the ethics of hanging cookware from non-critical conduits until the detector decided to join the debate. And then they laughed so hard that Kestrel's camera caught joy instead of incidents for a change. 2 days out, a distress icon fluttered on the fringe of their scope, the way birds do right before weather, and Jocks angled the nose without waiting for Virtue to draft a memo. Hab shuttle, he read, stuck in a pocket of the course that wandered off the map. Life support trending wrong. Pediatric module aboard, and Alira was already unstrapping, which was all the permission anyone needed. They re-entered the metallic drift at a slower pitch this time, Jocks's fingers light on the thruster taps. Alira's eyes half closed and listening with bones that had learned these chords in nursery songs. Engines to hum, not speak, she said, and he idled down to a vibration the hull could sing to without being noticed by the louder parts of the universe. Right 6, up 1, drift, she added, and the Kestrel complied like a dog that had finally decided this new pack was legitimate. The shuttle hung in a skein of whiskers, like a fly in metallic dew, its thermal signature an insult to the concept of mercy. Jocks bumped the Kestrel in close, kissed couplers that had no right to be compatible and yet always are in emergencies, and handed air across with the tenderness of someone returning a borrowed child. Alira slid outside on a tether, tail snugged under a guide strap, and cut iron threads with a patience that made the field change key by degree. She hummed under her breath, and the whiskers slackened, as if embarrassed to have been rude. Inside the shuttle, 3 tiny cradles blinked their need in colors that don't exist on good days. And jocks tied their lungs to the kestrel's honesty, while counting in 4s, because sometimes that is what hands can do when minds want to run. Sing, Alira called softly over combs, and he did, low and off-key, a nonsense tune on a nonsense day, and the field quieted one notch, like a bar full of strangers, deciding to let a story finish. They pulled free without tearing anything that mattered, which is what success looks like between alarms. And when the shuttle's pilot could finally form a sentence, it was, "How?" stretched over gratitude that hadn't learned words yet. "Don't argue with songs," Jock said, surprising himself, and Alira's laugh over Kunz made the kestrel's lights feel warmer. They escorted the shuttle to a proper lane and turned back toward the long cut. And for the first time, Jocks didn't feel like he was returning from a crisis, so much as practicing the job they had accidentally invented. He wrote up the incident report in plain language, flagged the chorus pocket for traffic, and saved a private note about the way Alira's call to sing had made his hands smarter, which he filed under training, because some truths become better if you call them technical. That night, the nest did not require negotiation. He climbed in first. She followed with a satisfied little huff, and the thermal curtain trembled in the ventilation like a flag that had decided not to be patriotic so much as accurate. Morning brought them a corridor slot, a customs ping, and an open message on the public band from a ship with a paint job that tried to look official and failed at both politesse and grammar. "Your salvage is our salvage," the message said, which is the refrain of people who arrive late to a good idea. And Alira's crest dimmed in that way it does when appetite becomes calculation. "No one is taking seed vials from a hab," Jock said, not loudly, but with the tone that convinces engines to start on cold mornings. And Alira smiled a very small, very sharp smile that meant we agree and they will learn. They didn't break rules. They bent vectors, slid into a patrol shadow with a transponder handshake that made the would-be thieves reconsider how hungry they really were, and let the official ship's very loud existence do the rest. "You did not sing," Alira noted later, curled warm beside him in a nest that now included exactly one legally sanctioned blanket wall. "I hummed paperwork," he replied, and she laughed until the detector scolded the pan again. By the time New Kyoto's traffic halo rose ahead like a city built from patient stars, Jocks had gotten used to the way her tail tapped a rhythm on the console when she thought, and she had gotten used to the way his hands went still before they chose trust, and the kestrel had gotten used to being a pronoun that included them both. "Next," Alira said, gaze fixed outward, voice calm, "we claim," and he heard inside the single word all the cousins, courts, and traditions it contained. "Next," he agreed, "we file, we argue kindly, we cook something that doesn't violate safety protocols, and we find you a lawyer who understands blankets." And she reached over and pressed 2 fingers to the back of his hand like a seal. The station grew, customs pinged again, and he realized that the thing he had been avoiding most for years belonging had snuck aboard wearing a dragon's grin and a nest's logic, and he decided, experimentally, not to fight it. When the beacon for final approach chimed, Alira glanced at him, and he nodded, and the ship moved as if a single person had given a single command, which is the closest thing to magic pilots ever admit to. Customs had them on a tidy vector, and the kestrel was behaving like a citizen when the band filled with a voice that mistook volume for law. A not quite official cutter sliding out from the shadow of a traffic buoy with weapons hot and grammar wounded. "Transmit cargo and surrender trajectory," the voice said, the universal chorus of latecomers to other people's work. "Seed vials already delivered, courier already on manifest. Nothing aboard but parts and a nest," Jocks replied, polite enough to pass inspections and pointed enough to offend thieves. The cutter painted them anyway. A splash of red across the scope that felt like someone else's hand on a wallet, and Alira's crest dimmed into the particular calm that meant appetite had graduated to geometry. "Open cargo," she said, scales brightening along the jaw in a frequency that Kestrel's sensors labeled as superstition and Jax's bones labeled as maybe. "That's vacuum and bad ideas," he said, "because pilots specialize in enumerating risks before choosing them." "Do you trust me?" she asked, and the question was less a request than a hinge. Doors swing or they don't. He cycled the bay through the internal seals and let the cutter think they were surrendering, while Rhea-like muscle memory kept Ancilla-style lungs he didn't have on standby, which is to say he trimmed attitude so the Kestrel's shadow might catch what came next. Alara stood in the open mouth of the ship with wings slightly spread and eyes half closed, and for a moment she did not look like a person so much as an instrument deciding which note to play. She breathed. Not fire, the universe is already full of that, but something denser. A ribbon of condensed light that should not have crossed vacuum, and yet did. A signature older than maps, and precisely aimed at the cutter's weapons array, as if the stars themselves had filed a complaint. The impact was a quiet subtraction, a systems-level embarrassment more than an explosion, and the cutter tumbled into a new humility, with its guns converted to sculpture, and its pilot suddenly interested in careers with fewer verbs. Jox closed the bay, fingers steady, because fear gets calmer when competence shows up, and eased the Kestrel back onto the customs vector before anyone in a uniform had to pretend not to see favors done at bad angles. Alara swayed, heat debt finding her like a bill that knows the address, and he caught her with the unceremonious efficiency of someone lifting an engine that has decided to nap. "Heat," she murmured, words soft around the edges, and he nodded, because this was a problem he could fix with copper, valves, and the kind of attention that has learned to measure in breaths. He rerouted waste heat into the coil under the deck they built for exactly this, set the thermostat to Dragon Honest instead of Human Brave, and slid into the nest with her, while the ship hummed a register lower out of either respect or the physics of good ducting. "Don't do that unless we have to," he said quietly, and she nodded against his shoulder. Not in agreement exactly, but in shared understanding of prices and receipts. Customs pinged 3 times in patient succession, and then stopped pinging because the Kestrel looked like a small tub behaving itself, and that is how competent people get away with surviving. When Alira's heat steadied, and her breathing returned to the 5-count rhythm she unconsciously taught rooms, Jox filed a very boring report about a cutter with equipment failure and a course correction due to routine cargo bay cycling, which is the kind of sentence paperwork enjoys. "Stars should not do that," he said later, halfway between accusation and awe. "Dragons should not either," she answered, honest as gravity, but sometimes the old songs answer. He didn't say thank you because the shape of it was too small. He tightened a fitting on the heat coil instead, and replaced the gasket he'd meant to live with for another month, which is a mechanic's version of flowers. New Kyoto rose ahead, traffic carving polite arcs in a sky tamed by schedules and fees, and the Kestrel came in under a name that had been solo yesterday and plural today. The customs officer yawned in their direction, scanned them for contraband they did not carry, and waved them toward registry with the unconcern of someone whose job is to let stories go past if those stories move like professionals. Registry smelled like paper, pretending to be electrons. Alara's name went into the system with Jox, listed as crew and emergency contact, which in most cultures counts as a declaration, even if no one brings flowers. "Claim office. Second ring," the clerk said, bored and useful. Fees waived for mixed crews filing cross-cultural petitions during peace windows, which sounded like policy and felt like a door. Alira's crust flattened, not with fear, but with the deliberate calm of someone adjusting armor made of manners. And Jox felt the old reflex to run a lone stir, and then sit when he did not feed it. They walked the corridor to a sign that had forgotten to be welcoming, and into a room where traditions wore suits. An elder draconian with scales gone silver looked up with the amusement of people who have seen this exact courage 10,000 times and are still fond of it. "Lineage?" the elder asked, voice like stone taught to be polite, and Alira recited names, places, arguments, and the kind of geography that runs in blood, stumbling only on the parts that had been left blank for her to fill later. "Territory?" the elder continued, eyes brightening at the word like a dragon hearing the weather change. "Emberwake inheritance. Hinter range colloquial Montara on the human charts," Alira said. using the human word with a little joy, as if tasting a vowel that would be hers. Contested, the elder said, neither sad nor pleased, simply factual in the way gravity refuses opinion. Challenges will be posted for 7 days. Champion allowed by tradition, if mate or blood. The word mate walked into the room and sat down without asking, as words sometimes do. Alera did not look at Jacques, because courage often happens best without eye contact. Jacques did not clear his throat, because announcing the obvious is not the same as living it. File the intent to claim, the elder said, stamping something ancestral and electronic at the same time. And sleep well. Tomorrow is for voices, and the day after for teeth. They returned to the kestrel, and the nest had the good manners to look exactly the same as before the word mate had entered their vocabulary, which helped. Jacques cooked dinner at a temperature that would not set off alarms, and Alira pretended to enjoy the mildness because diplomacy is a 2-burner stove. On my world, she said finally, weightless and serious at once. Mateship is a declaration and a geography. We speak it and end. Then we stand somewhere and defend the sentence until it becomes true. On mine, he answered, we sign, argue, and then make breakfast. And she smiled, because translation is always a comedy first and a treaty second. He reached across the tiny distance between their hands and set his paw on the back of hers the way you test a circuit. And she turned her hand and closed 2 fingers over his the way you mark one as live. Tomorrow, she said, as if naming a star. Tomorrow, he agreed, as if agreeing to gravity. The challenges posted at dawn, like Weather 17 names, all cousins of a sort, according to the strange algebra of clan, all stronger on paper than the person Jacques had promised himself to help, all larger, older, more practiced at the sort of ritual that turns history into a sport. The courtyard outside the claim office filled with scales and opinions. Humans came too, because humans smell a story the way ships smell heat, and a clerk with a bell tried to make the noise sit in rows with limited success. Alera stood with her shoulders level and her crest calm, and Jacques stood beside her with both boots on ground that did not belong to him yet, which is a feeling humans specialize in and survive with jokes. Mate, a dragon said, their smile all enamel and tradition sharpened for use. Crew, Jacques said, then mate, because there are days when precision and courage become synonyms. He did not list credentials. He held up his hand instead, and the elder from yesterday examined it like one examines a tool or a treaty calluses from wrenches. A thin fresh cut across the palm where a cable had argued. Heat coil oil that lingers even after soap. Work, the elder said, satisfied, as if that were all the resume a person should ever need. By law, a larger cousin intoned, challenge may be met by blood or mate, to first blood or to yield, and the crowd murmured because rituals comfort crowds more than they comfort participants. Yield would be kinder, Jacques said under his breath, and Alira flicked him a look that contained laughter and warning in equal parts. We play by rules, she whispered back, but we choose which ones to emphasize. The big cousin stepped forward in armor that had opinions, and Jacques did not step back, because forward had already been chosen yesterday in a cargo bay with stars in it. He did not intend to win by strength. He intended to win by reading, which humans have always used to survive dragons and taxes. First blood, the elder called, and the courtyard exhaled. The cousin charged with a confidence that had never been taught to check corners, and Jacques stepped aside in a geometry learned from dodging falling tools and badly supported crates. He popped an emergency flare, one of the cheap ones station vendors sell to people, with more optimism than gear, and lit the morning afoot from the cousin's eyes. Dragons are immune to fire. They are not immune to flash, because eyes are eyes. And the cousin stumbled 1/2 step of bewilderment that was exactly long enough for Jacques to reach up, pluck a ceremonial scale from the strap with a borrowed ritual he pretended belonged to him, and nick one proud cheek with the scale's back edge. First blood, Jacques said, and for once his voice did not shake when it had earned the right not to. Silence tilted. The elder's mouth twitched into a shape that was not disapproval, and somewhere in the crowd a clerk started writing precedent in a margin with unnecessary pressure. The big cousin blinked his sight back into the world, touched the smear of gold on his jaw, and laughed honest, startled, and without malice, which is how intelligent people respond when reality teaches them efficiently. Claim stands, the elder declared, bell ringing once like a seal pressed into hot wax. Territory defended by wit is still defended. The courtyard loosened its shoulders. Challenges evaporated into bravery saved for other days. And dragons who had arrived to be entertained left having been instructed, which is a better outcome for everyone. Alira turned to Jocks with a look that contained the exact amount of gratitude that doesn't embarrass a human in public, and placed 2 fingers on his wrist, the way mates mark pulse and promise simultaneously. You negotiated with light, she said softly. You negotiated with a recorder and a nest, he replied, because truth is a team sport. The elder stamped a final document that made a mountain in a place called Hinter Range answer to a new name that fit Alira's mouth, and handed over a key that wasn't a key so much as coordinates and permission. Go see what you own and what owns you back, the elder advised, which is wisdom in any century. They walked out of the office, and the city performed its usual magic for people who have just done something irreversible. Lights looked friendlier. Food smelled like celebration, and the distance to their ship felt like a parade even without music. Montara? Jocks asked, trying out the human word again, because sometimes you keep a thing by saying it right. Home, Alira said, and the word did the work 1,000 documents pretend to do and rarely manage. Back aboard, Jocks logged the claim in 3 systems, set the Kestrel's nose toward the coordinate block that would soon contain a landing pad and a dozen arguments about how to fix a roof, and tightened the last fitting on the heat coil, because habits keep ships honest. Alira cooked something only slightly illegal by fire code and declared it mild. He cried one dignified tear and conceded it was, for once, not a lie. They lay under the absurd treaty blanket, watching the panel lights make their small, trustworthy constellations. And for once no one asked, "Do you trust me?" Because sometimes the right questions learn to retire. Tomorrow, she said again, but this time it meant roads and fences, and a place where wings could learn new weather. Tomorrow, he said, and set an alarm for dawn, because humans bring tools to miracles, even when the miracles are theirs. Hinter Range rose out of the atmosphere, like teeth arranged by a poet, dark pines threaded through stone and ice, lakes shaped like commas where weather paused to think. And Jocks put the Kestrel down on a shelf of granite that had the decency to be level if flattered correctly. Alira stood at the viewport with both hands flat to the glass, scales drinking sunlight in a way the panels could not, and said one word with no ceremony at all. Home. They stepped out into air that bit and forgave in the same breath, and the land did what true places do when somebody says the right name. It listened without promising anything. The holdings turned out to be a valley with a stubborn road, 2 ancient wind towers asleep under snow, a skeletal landing frame that had ideas above its budget, and a lodge that had been built by someone who liked beams big enough to teach earthquakes manners. Roof first, Jocks said, because roofs are the grammar of civilization. And Alira nodded and started dragging fallen timber like a one-dragon work crew that considered leverage a personal challenge. They mapped rooms with tape and laughter, marked a place for a corner galley that wouldn't set off 6 kinds of alarms, and dedicated a square of floor to a nest large enough to be called policy. Jocks traced the wall studs and found honest wood beneath the paint's bluster, then bolted a heat coil under the main room planks and tied it to a stove that would accept dragon breath as a valid setting without filing a complaint. Alira reskinned the old wind towers with new fabric from the Kestrel's stores and sang to the bearings until they remembered what spinning without sulking felt like, and the valley's hum changed key by half a tone as the lines woke and began to push. They raised a makeshift beacon on the ridge, tuned to civil bands, and set to whisper their shared surname as an address. And Jocks keyed in a flight profile labeled, Hinter Short Final, do not embarrass yourself, which is how you teach future landings to behave. That night, they cooked at a temperature that made the rafters approve and sat on the floor because chairs would be a tomorrow problem, their backs against a wall that felt like it had been waiting to hold exactly this weight. Your grandmother chose a place with weather and opinions, Jocks said, eyeing a cloud bank, writing a letter to the ridge, and Alira smiled with the kind of pride that translates as inheritance, even when no papers are present. In our stories, she said, territory is not owned. It is negotiated with wind, stone, water, the old echoes. And she tapped the floor, once like a signature that respected both parties. He drew up a supply list that could bankrupt enthusiasm. She negotiated with it by crossing out 2 luxuries and adding 3 necessities. And together they began the slow violence called settling in a way that tries not to bruise. The first neighbor arrived before noon had remembered its manners. A ranger in a parka repaired more times than policy permits, and a snow crawler that had learned to be loyal by being rescued. Jurisdiction says I check on claims what come with bells, she said without malice, glancing at horns, wings, and the kestrel, as if adding them to a list she'd been making for years. Name's Reyes. I'm the person folks call when weather overachieves. Jocks. Ship rat turned landlord against his will, he said. Hand out, and a lira of Emberwake, Alira said, crest politely low, and the ranger's eyes softened, because introductions done right are the simplest magic. Storm wall tonight, Reyes warned, nodding toward the horizon where the cloud's letter had become a sentence. Grids twitchy this far out. Folks downriver lean on this valley's old towers when they're sulk, which is neighbors speak for welcome to infrastructure. We'll hold the line, Jock said, which a human can say without bragging, because the line is always longer than the person speaking. And Alira added, we will share heat, which is a treaty. Reyes left them 2 coils of cable and a look that said I count on counting you, and the day bent toward work, because work is the only appointment that keeps itself out here. The storm arrived like a bureaucracy with momentum, slow at first and instrumental and present and uninterested in anyone's calendar. Snow wrote its case across the ridge. Wind tested the towers for compliance, and the lodge thrummed with a kind of gratitude that feels like endurance. At dusk, a distress ping tapped their band short range. Low battery, the tone of people who had tried to be brave in a vehicle that had no more verbs left. Downriver, Alira said, head tilting, bones reading weather the way she reads iron. Ice road failed. 2 humans, 1 injured, heat declining. Jocks grabbed the field kit, a coil of rope that had saved more than cargo, and a portable heat manifold he shouldn't have been proud of, and absolutely was. And together they pushed the snow crawler into a world the storm thought it owned. Visibility did that thing where it makes you guess at your own hands. But Alira's tail tapped out distances against the crawler's wall, and Jocks trusted counts in 5s rather than eyes and zeros. And the machine accepted their math as law. They found the wreck cradled against a drift, 1 wheel sulking at an angle no apology could fix, and a couple huddled in the shadow of bad decisions, blankets failing to negotiate with the wind. Heat first, Alira said, kneeling with the care that makes ice consider mercy, and Jocks built a bubble from tarps and the manifold, feeding in the crawler's waist warmth, and a whisper of dragon to teach the air how to stay. The injured one had the color of someone auditioning for hypothermia, and Ilara trained instincts in Jacques' hands learned from too many ports. Not from Ilara, but from the idea of her laid pressers, and counted breath until the rhythm belonged to the room and not the storm. Alira anchored the crawler's winch to a boulder that accepted supervision, and with 4 hands and a tail for fairness, they made the world pretend to be a ramp long enough to get everyone into a machine that believed in second chances. Back at the lodge, Reyes was waiting with Muggs and a look that pretended not to be impressed, and the grid, persuaded by towers and temper, decided to stay up after all. 15 families downstream are drawing on your line, Reyes said. Eyes on the meters. If those towers hold, they eat hot and sleep safe. And Alira's crest glowed like a kettle that had just learned its purpose. Then we stay up too, Jock said, and they took shifts teaching a valley to breathe through a blizzard. Morning arrived like a truce signed in pencil, and with it a convoy the kind of small migration valleys do after bad weather snow-scarred trucks and tracked sleds. Kids under blankets that had learned optimism, and elders with the unflappable look of people who have been disappointed by worse. They came for power lines, for coffee, for the promise of a dry floor if roofs decided to practice failure again, and for the old ritual of standing in a newly occupied place to see what story it tells. Alira stood on the lodge steps with a kettle in her hands and steam rising in a halo that made children stare and then grin. And Jocks moved among cables and plugs like a street performer whose tricks keep lights on. Fuel mix is wrong on that genset, he told a neighbor whose entire posture said, loaned, not returned, and swapped the nozzle with a kind of speed that makes gratitude look like religion. Your pan heater's backfeeding the strip, he told another, catching it with a breaker before it caught fire with headlines. And your leg's fine, but your pride needs rest, he told the injured one from last night, which is a prescription any doctor would approve. Alira taught kids to breathe warm into cupped hands on a count of 5 because rhythm keeps fear in its seat, and tucked woven charms into the newel posts because houses like to be told they're seen. Reyes hauled a coil up the ridge like a woman who had forgotten how to be tired and refused to relearn. And Jacques followed because some invitations are orders, and they walked the span between towers looking for the lie that would undo the day. They found it where storms like to whisper, and a guy lines anchor under a drift, ice chewing at temper, metal beginning to believe and surrender, and Jacques taught the line a better story with a come along and an oath, while Alira warmed the anchor stone just enough to give back elasticity without waking cracks. Dragons are good at asking rock to behave, she said, matter of fact in a way that would have sounded like bragging from anyone else, and the line sang higher, contented as a well-fed instrument. Down below, the lodge's chimney wrote a steady sentence into the sky, and kids made a game of counting in 5s up the stairs and 4s back down, because children domesticate the rituals adults pretend are for emergencies. When the valley exhaled as one after the grid took a deep breath and held it on purpose, Reyes finally allowed herself a small smile. You too are going to be a problem, she said, which out here means solution, and handed over a battered directory of local frequencies as a knighthood. Register a community node, she added. You keep this valley humming. The valley will keep you fed. And Alira accepted the book like a ceremonial blade disguised as paper. In the lull that follows survival, when adrenaline hands the room back to furniture, a courier drone shouldered through the wind and bumped against the porch with the manners of a relative who owes you money. Jacques cracked it open and unfolded a thin holopage with the embossed seal of the claim office and a smell. Like a filing cabinet had learned to sweat. Petition for reconsideration, he read, the words hostile by formatting alone. Alleging irregular procedure in champion designation. Hearing set in 48 hours. Provisional injunction on development pending review, which is bureaucracy's way of sending weather after you when clouds fail. Alira read it once, crest motionless, and twice, crest lowering in a way that meant not fear, but arithmetic, the reallocation of resources, from nest building to argument building. Cousins, she said, not bitter, just accurate. And Jacques felt something complicated and human unspool inside him, half anger, half the old instinct to run alone, and then stop because the nest in the corner had acquired mass. Reyes whistled through her teeth like a kettle. They always try paper after they lose blood, she said, amused and tired at once. You'll want a city advocate who knows dragon precedent and human loopholes and where the coffee is free, and she scribbled 2 names that looked like passwords. Also, she added, don't go in with just law bring a valley, and pointed at the people warming their hands on a kettle they did not own in a house that had started naming them. They rehearsed arguments between chores, because chores keep the blood from thinking it's in charge. Alira framed tradition, not as weapon, but as promise, kept better by the person who had just used it correctly. And Jacques drafted affidavits that translated kindness into kilowatt hours and rescues into signatures, which is an art and a science, and a little bit of theft from cynicism. Kids practiced saying neighbor with dragon vowels and human consonants, while their grown-ups practiced standing still in a way that makes rooms listen. And the nest acquired a second blanket that had earned its spot during the night storm. When the sky finally grew curious about blue again, they pointed the kestrel back toward New Kyoto with a cargo hold full of affidavits, a valley's goodwill folded into paper, and a kettle on the stove, just in case courtrooms are improved by warmth, which they are. At the ridge, Alira touched the wind tower's guy line again, a goodbye that sounded like behave, and the line answered in the polite key it had learned. 2 days, Jacques said, strapping in. We argue, we win. We come back and finish the roof, and it came out as a vow that had already fought and expected to fight again. 2 days, Alira echoed, placing 2 fingers on the panel between them. a place their hands always meet before the ship pretends to be one person, and the kestrel lifted with the confidence of a house that has briefly remembered being a ship. The hearing chamber looked like someone had taught a cathedral how to file. All stone acoustics and soft screens built for voices that carry. And Jocks took the left seat because pilots like controls, even when the controls are microphones. Alira's crest lay calm as a sheathed blade, and behind them sat a row that could not be entered into evidence, but mattered anyway. Reyes, in her patched parka. 2 elders with hands that had known rope in winter, the couple from the wreck with color back in their faces, and 4 kids practicing 5-count breaths because the room made lungs forget. The petitioner arrived with cousins and a briefcase whose corners had been sharpened by argument. Their armor metaphorical this time, their smiles tuned to precedent, not people. Procedure, the lead cousin intoned, voice oiled. Irregular champion designation, undue influence, and the introduction of non-draconian devices into a ritual context, which is court fully lost. Please rewind. Response, the adjudicator prompted. A silver-scaled elder whose gaze had the weight of mountain shade, and Jocks stood because standing makes words behave, even when the words are humble. Champion designation was by mateship, spoken and shared in territory, he said, not loudly, letting the phrase sit like a tool placed where it belongs. Defense was to first blood, met without injury beyond ritual minimum, witnessed by your officer, and recorded without objection. Alira followed on the same breath, voice steady and lit from inside by the thing dragons keep for moments like this. Tradition is not weakened by being understood, she said, addressing the cousins and the walls equally. It is kept better when those who invoke it also carry it after, as heat, shelter, and service. Reyes stepped to the rail with hands out of her pockets, a posture that admits weather and tells courts what it did yesterday. 15 homes drew off their towers during the blizzard, she said, nodding toward Alira and Jocks, without making them saints. These 2 kept the grid singing. I'm not here to teach law. I'm here to say my people ate hot and slept safe. The injured man lifted, his sleeve to show healing where frostbite had intended to sign its name, which is not medical evidence, but is the kind juries believe when the world is behaving. The kids performed 5-count for the room, their breath condensing into commas that made adults remember poems they hadn't studied. And someone in the petitioner's row looked away because children are unreasonable witnesses. The cousins tried a new tack because paper breeds new tacks. Even if champion stands, the lawyer said, development must be stayed pending impact review. A shiprat and a rebel lack the infrastructure. Jocks lifted a slate, not to drown the room in documents, but to put 1 page under a light. Community node registered, power share agreements signed, wind towers refit and certified, emergency heat manifold built to code. And here, he said, sliding 1 more page forward, over 100 signatures from the valley, opting into our line in storms. Alira added a single woven charm to the pile, small and bright as honesty. Houses answer to those who answer them, she said simply, which is not a statute, but might as well be. Silence did that, sagged the way rooms do when an argument runs out of oxygen, and the adjudicator let it sit a heartbeat longer to make sure no stray theatrics survived. Petition denied, the elder said at last, voice like a stamp that remembers wax. Claim stands, development authorized under mixed accord and community compact. Tradition has not been harmed by being useful. There was a sound in the room that courts write down as murmurs and people remember as relief. And Reyes clapped Jocks' shoulder with a hand that had been an anchor last night and would be again tomorrow. The cousins bowed with tight grace, because even disappointed dragons are not fools, and filed out to sharpen new arguments for other days. A clerk thrust a packet into Jocks' palm seals, codes, a small grant labeled resilience, as if the treasury had learned the feeling. Alira touched 2 fingers to it and to Jocks' wrist in the same motion, signing both paper and person. Outside, New Kyoto's light felt earned instead of rented, and the kestrel looked very small and perfectly sufficient waiting on her pad, which is how home looks the day you win it. They launched on a standard departure as if nothing extraordinary had happened, which is the best camouflage for miracles, and set the nose toward Hinter Range with a hold full of legal weight and lumber list. Halfway home, the band coughed a civilian panic, clipped and honest. Outbound shuttle, family aboard, hit by micro-debris over the pass, one tank hissing, can't hold altitude to the valley, a voice said with the frantic decorum of people trying to be brave on channel. Elira was already unstrapped, tail clipped into a guide ring, as Kestrel swung into a vector a little wilder than civil, and exactly as safe as necessary. We are 3 minutes. Prep to share air and warmth, Jock said, because sometimes announcing competence makes it truer, and punched up the cargo bay seals, like a conductor tapping a stand. They matched the shuttle's fall with a grip as gentle as math allows, Elira moving through the bay like a gasket come to life, throwing a foam collar against a seam that had forgotten its vow. And Jocks fed the small craft lungs until its numbers stopped making threats. A child watched. Elira's crest glow and reached a hand out across species and doctrine to touch a scale at the kind of trust courts should have to witness before they issue forms. And Elira bowed her head the way dragons do when given rank by children. Down together, Jocks told the pilot, and they rode the pass in tandem, like two leaves being careful. Kestrel's shadow wrapped around the shuttle like a thick line in a book. At the lodge, Reyes had a triage rug down and a kettle ready, which is how you receive ships and company both, and the valley exhaled as if the court stamp had included weather. "Welcome home, landowners," Reyes said, which somehow managed to be both a joke and a knighting, and tossed Jocks a coil of new line as a present that was also a job. The roof went up like a lesson in verbs measure, cut, lift, fit, and every board that seated clean felt like a paragraph in a story that was becoming legible. Elira skinned the ridge with a heat-shedding cap she hammered out of scrap and pride, humming a scale that kept her strikes consistent. And Jocks laid in a run of copper from stove to floor coil and felt the house's future temper curb toward kind. Neighbors brought wrong-sized screws and exactly the right jokes, and the kids painted a sign that said Hinter in letters that would embarrass a typographer and thrill a map, and it was perfect. They poured a pad flat enough to accept a ship politely, etched a falcon with a dragon's tail into the corner where no one would scold it, and tuned the beacon to whisper their name only when weather needed the reminder. At night, the nest became less a negotiation and more a place sleep finds without asking. The thermal curtain retired to symbolic duty, and the Kestrel's small galley started to smell less like alarm and more like recipes. Work found them with the regularity of tide Reyes' frequency first, then ones from farther downriver as word learned the road calls for lend us a battery, our heater lies, can your little ship tow our pride out of that ditch without witnesses? And they answered with an economy that felt like belonging. Jocks fixed a winged vane with a hinge and a complement. Elira sat on a porch and taught a grandmother 5-count against panic while the kettle learned to whistle and dragon, and the valley's hum settled into a register that admitted new instruments. They wrote a rate card that charged money when it needed to, and charged pi when it didn't, and a ledger that recorded favors as units of heat, which is better economics than it sounds. Between jobs, Jocks took the Kestrel up for short turns so the ship wouldn't forget how to be sky, and Elira practiced landing on the pad in crosswinds until the line. Between house and ship blurred into a comfortable grammar. Work without banners, Jocks said one evening, looking at their bench where a new altar had begun a coil cut clean and labeled lesson in nostalgia. A ribbon of Zilani weave from a passing trader who liked their coffee, a bolt from the wind tower polished by idleness into talisman, and Elira nodded. Home without walls, she countered, meaning not the house, but the perimeter of who counted in it. And he touched her wrist with 2 fingers in the place their hands always meet to launch. The board on the wall a scavenged panel that once told a cargo bay when to. Worry blinked a polite amber that nobody in the house had wired, which is to say the valley had learned to call them without numbers. Schoolroom heater failed, dusk in 30, temp falling, smalls inside, Reyes said over the line, voice even not because it wasn't urgent, but because performance shakes hands with panic and leads it out. Elira was already at the door with the field kit and a blanket that had begun as a treaty and become habit. And Jocks killed the stove, flipped the coil to keep the house gentle, and keyed the Kestrel's short hop because sometimes the fastest road is above the road. They sat down behind the school like a rumor arriving on time, and the kids cheered before they shivered, which is how courage is taught accidentally. and Alira herded them into a corner and turned 5 count into a game that made their breath behave. Jocks opened the wall on the heater and found the lie. Same as always pried in a wire, not rated to carry it, and taught it humility with a replacement and a reminder note for the 3 Adatem version of the teacher. He tied the room's air to Kestrel's lungs for 20 minutes to catch up on the lost warmth, the ship purring with the satisfaction of being useful at ground level. And Alira brewed cocoa in a kettle that would henceforth be part of the school inventory by common law. When the room's numbers sat down and behaved, the teacher pressed a crayon portrait into Alira's hand, wings exaggerated beyond physics, and a nest drawn like a sun. And Jocks pretended not to see her tuck it into the field kit as if it were a certification. Back home, the pad steamed faintly in cold air. The beacon blinked once in approval, and the roof made a sound that old carpenters call satisfied, which is more valuable than inspections. They ate stew that had never met a fire code and yet passed inspection by every meaningful metric. And Jocks penciled a list for tomorrow that included roof trim, filter changes, and a note in the margin that read Ask Alira about songs for magnets. The board blinked once more, softer, not a call so much as a suggestion. And they both looked without needing to ask, because the valley had taught them to hear quiet alarms. Tomorrow, Alira said, smiling against his shoulder, the word now meaning we will keep showing up where the world misplaces small things. And Jocks answered it with the only vow that matters in any court. I'll bring the kit, he said, and the house hummed in the key that made ships jealous. The day began with good weather and ended with a sky that had decided to write in teeth, the kind of dry lightning that teaches pine to remember it is oil wearing bark. And Reyes's voice on the valley net came in clipped and calm. Ridge strike, wind wrong, fire moving like a rumor that pays cash. Schoolhouse and 3 homesteads downslope, decision window small. Jocks didn't say anything heroic, because heroism is a poor fuel. He said, Kestrel up, tower fans to push, river pumps online, and the house acknowledged with a contented thrum as he threw the coil to standby, took the kit, and counted steps to the pad while Alira braided her hair back with the efficiency of a ritual that needs both hands free. The plume rose just beyond the ridge like a new continent, amber at the edges and ugly at the bottom, and the wind had opinions that would not hold still for manners. Behind the heat, Reyes's crawler spat gravel and resolve. Kids filed into the school cellar with a 5 count that looked like courage teaching itself, and the tower spun a little higher, as if pretending to be rain. Fire break at the saddle, Reyes said, pointing with a hand that had already lifted more than orders today. Old cut line there. Fuel light if we make it lighter. Downwind flank wants to learn about humility, Jocks air. Alira, if your people have a song for cutting heat without feeding it, now would be an excellent class. Alira's crest dimmed into the serious color that means mathematics and dragon, and she nodded exactly once, which is consent and calculus together, and glanced at Jocks and did not say, do you trust me? Because the world had graduated past that question. They launched low, the Kestrel riding the ridge like she had been born to commute between hazards and houses. And Jocks put her down hard on the saddle to drop 2 pallets of hose and a spool of stubborn line while Reyes's volunteers ran like punctuation periods where things needed to stop, commas where breath needed to be taken, semicolons where roads remember being not quite roads. Alira stepped forward into the heat with her jaw set and her wings slightly raised, and the fire stopped looking like theater and started looking like a physics student ready for a lecture. She breathed not starlight, no system to ruin here, but a broad, low ribbon of heat that changed the fuel's mind without feeding it. A controlled unburn that dusted needles into ash and laid down a stripe of already finished across the path the fire wanted. It cost her, heat debt arriving like a tide under ribs, and Jocks felt the wobble in her steps even from the cockpit, heard it in the way the Kestrel's deck echoed her weight when she came back up between passes, and tuned the underfloor coil hotter by 2 notches he had promised never to use except in emergencies, and like most promises worth making, he was now breaking properly. Reyes's line crews worked the cold edge with tools that had names because the valley likes to know its instruments. Kids in the cellar counted 5 for breath and 4 for courage, like rules in a book about how to sit. Still while adults rewrite the weather, And the school stove kept Coco honest, because sugar is courage's cheaper cousin, and no less valid in group settings. The wind turned rude at the worst moment, as wind does, curling a sheet of flame toward the creek, where summer had taught water to pretend it was stone. Jock shoved the kestrel into the gap, and used downwash to persuade fire to notice the firebreak's completed homework, while Alira stood at the line and drew one last ribbon across a patch that hadn't gotten the memo. When the front hit the brake, it didn't stop like a wall so much as remember a previous appointment and go around with loss of face. And men with shovels finished the argument with sentences like, "Hold here," and "Not today," and the ridge, which had been listening, nodded in its slow geological way. Alira stepped backward into the kestrel and sat with the posture of people who have paid a bill and are waiting for the receipt, and Jock slid onto the deck with her, thumbed the coil hotter, and pressed his palm to her wrist in the spot their hands always meet before launch, which in emergencies doubles as the place they keep tenderness. "Heat debt," she said, not apologizing, just labeling. And he said, "Paid with interest," and the kestrel's coil hummed in approval as copper moved kindness around like power. Reyes came up the ramp filthy and smiling, not a contradiction out here, and pointed with her chin toward a line of smoke, now writing smaller words. "You two just taught a ridge the word enough," she said, which is the kind of compliment people like Jocks and Alira can bear without flinching. "School's safe, homes are cranky but intact, and I'm calling the break the treaty line unless somebody objects, which they won't." Neighbors came with water and jokes that had survived weather. Hot hands put cups into tired hands, and the valley did that thing living places do when danger leaves. It added everyone back to itself, with attendance taken aloud. Alira finished paying the last of what the breath had taken and leaned her head against Jocks's shoulder in a way that made the knee kestrel's floor feel like a room even with the ramp open, and he watched the plume become a story already arguing with the dawn, and believed, experimentally and with increasing confidence, that they belonged to this geography and it to them. Night brought stars like receipts, and an ache in Jocks's hands that felt like verbs done correctly. The nest at home had acquired ash in its weave and a new blanket that no one remembered owning until someone remembered giving. And the bench altar looked busy and honest. Coil segment labeled nostalgia is not a plan. Wind tower bolt smoothed by thumb. A kid's crayon dragon with a falcon's tail and the word hinter written like laughter. "Tomorrow we fix the creek pump that lied," Jock said to the ceiling, because ceilings are good at hearing plans, and Alira murmured assent into his shoulder in a language that sounded like ember logic. And they let sleep find them early, because dawn would arrive demanding receipts. Morning did not bring an alarm so much as a suggestion. The board blinked its polite amber once. Not urgent, and the valley net, which had learned discretion, coughed up only weather, and a note from the school thanking them with a list of names and a request that Alira visit for show and tell in dragon, which made Jax grin into his coffee. He did the small things that keep big things from happening, tightened every fitting that had learned a new word overnight, bled the air from the upstream manifold that disappointed them yesterday, sharpened the only axe that could be trusted not to think itself a sword, and left a note taped to the heater cover for the 3A.M version of himself that read, "Check here first. You know better." Alira did the small things that make places decide to house you, tucked 3 woven charms into rafters that had earned them, ground spice that would be mild on purpose and not as a compromise, repaired a child's wind toy so it would spin the way the towers did and not sulk when wind came from the wrong direction, and set aside a ribbon of copper to teach the stove a new trick. Reyes stopped by without reason and left with a coil of line, because reasons are implied, and her crawler idled in the yard like a cow that had learned to purr. And she looked at the ridge and said, "Still holding," which is poetry when spoken by people not paid to be poets. "Breakfast on the porch," Jocks announced, which is a sentence wealthier men should envy. And they ate hot things in cold air and watched a kestrel, the feathered kind this time balance on a gust, with the insolent competence of creatures that believe the sky is furniture. "Root?" Alira asked after, a habit neither of them would discard even with a valley to hold. And Jocks flipped a slate to the page where jobs fall in love with schedules and find homes, and pointed at 3, Reyes wanted an antenna tuned. A neighbor's pump was telling lies about voltage, and somewhere downriver, a footbridge had decided to remember it was a pile of wood. Also the school, Alira added. I promised to explain 5-count to first years, and why cocoa is medicine, and he nodded solemnly. Because civic duty is a spice that improves most recipes. They flew the Kestrel over the ridge on a hop too short to register as a flight in the story's pilots tell other pilots, and long. Enough to keep the ship feeling like a ship, and set down by the school where children in boots bigger than their arguments cheered the way engines like. Alira knelt and explained that breathing on purpose is a superpower, and that dragons use it before they use fire, because fire is expensive and breath is free. And Jocks fixed the heater's second lie while pretending not to listen and absolutely listening. He left a note inside the panel for the teacher that said your courage is working perfectly, and tightened the last screw with the satisfaction of someone who has earned the right to be neat. And Alira left with drawings in both hands, which is pay and proof and property deed at once. They took the long way home on purpose over the river where the pump hummed honestly no, along the ridge where the treaty line traced its new grammar across the old, past a field where a sign read thank you in letters that made Reyes snort and blink too often, and the Kestrel purred in the way ships do when they have decided their job description includes applause. Back at the lodge, a courier drone sulked onto the porch and coughed up a parcel wrapped in city tape and common sense. A certificate embossed with seal and precedent, authorizing not just a claim, but a corridor mixed operations, humanitarian assistance, and community grid authority under compact signed by the same adjudicator whose voice could make mountains pay attention. Alira touched 2 fingers to the seal, then to Jax's wrist in the exact place that launched ships and arguments, and the gesture felt like a switch closing a circuit the valley had wired for them while they were busy. We could write a banner, Jax said, purely as a joke, and Alira smiled with all the gravity of a dragon, about to be unserious. No banners, she said, just work, and the words fit the porch as if the house had been built to hang them like wind. They carried the certificate inside and placed it on the bench altar beside the coil labeled Nostalgia is not a plan. The wind bolt, the crayon dragon, and the tiny screw from a panel that would no longer lie. And the collection did not look like trophies so much as receipts. Evening came shyly as if embarrassed by last night's enthusiasm, and they cooked a meal that did not insult any censors. And the nest was warm because it had been designed by 2 species with excellent priorities. And the towers sang a polite harmony in the valley's preferred key. The board blinked a soft, familiar amber schoolroom light out again. River bridge wobble. Reyes's crawler a half-mile from a tire that thought about quitting, and Jocks didn't say yes, because yes had stopped being a decision and become a habitat. He stood, took the kit that had learned to carry both tools and promises, and grinned across the room at Alira, who was already braiding her hair back in the ritual that keeps both hands free. Home waited behind them, and above them house and ship. Ridge and root agreeing that belonging is a verb, and the valley's hum settled into a note that sounded like approval earning interest. Jocks didn't make a speech, because speeches are for people who haven't found their chores yet. He checked the coil, kissed 2 fingers, touched the panel where their hands always meet, and reached for his kit.